use. Uh, and so that's part of it. And then do a lot of grant writing for projects big and small, whether it's, I mean, right now, just working on a couple, like got projects that are, here's $20,000 to fix part of a diversion structure or a reservoir, to some larger ones that are $25 million to really improve a lot of huge infrastructure ditch systems that we have throughout the state. And we also do a lot of drought projects and funding people to try to do innovative drought projects throughout the state and working on scaling those up. So I'm gonna talk today just about water law a bit, because we could spend days talking about water law, and I'm not going to really give you the basics of what are water law. Instead, I'm going to really talk about water law in relation to what you all are doing, like consuming water for growing crops and efficiencies, and how does water law in Colorado interact with what you're doing specifically, and if you want to change how you're irrigating, and what does that mean? What are the goods and bads of that? And so I'm going to just be going through this and asking questions today, and then you too, Charlotte, if you have, you're part of the audience too, so just feel free to go along with this, and we'll go from there. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from this document that was put out now 7 years ago about use it or lose it, which is a phrase everybody's familiar with. But what does it really mean? And what are actually the nuances in water law that describe about how we measure a water right and the value of it? And whether or not we do conservation or change how efficient we are, how does that impact our water right? And what does that do? So I think the first part to start with is just that lose it. That's a very scary idea. And it's like, well, what does it mean to lose your water right? And how does that happen? So I guess the first question is, how does the state determine if a water right is abandoned or you lose your water right? Does anybody have any idea of that? How does the state determine if we abandon a water right and you lose it permanently? Okay, I've got a no clue. So I think what first comes to a lot of people's minds is, okay, if I don't use it, but what does that mean? I don't use it regularly. I don't use it often. I don't use as much as I did last week. I don't use as much as I did last year. But actually the bar for it's actually very difficult to have a water right abandoned in Colorado. And there's a couple things that have to happen in order for you to actually lose your water right. So a water right must not be put to beneficial use for over 10 years. And because every 10 years, we do our abandonment list in Colorado. And over those 10 years, what you see, if somebody uses a water right for 1 year, 2 years, they're not going to get put on the list. And maybe they're on a creek or a tributary that it's been so dry they haven't even had water in 10 years. They still can't be put on the list. If the supply is not available, they cannot be abandoned. If let's say maybe they're pulling water and it comes through a culvert and the culvert breaks and they've been working on it for 10 years to try to get this fixed. If they can prove and demonstrate they've been working on it, you still can't have your water right abandoned. You must show an intent to abandon, and the state must prove that you intend to abandon that. And that can usually be seen through often the most cases that you see with a water right that is going to be lost and abandoned. The head gate, you go there and you see, wow, this head gate in this ditch system is out of use and hasn't been used in decades. Or maybe it's even hard to find where the diversion is anymore. And so maybe the land, there's no agriculture happening on the land anymore. It's very difficult to even get in touch with the person who owns the water right. But you must show that there is an intent to abandon. And so just to give an example of how difficult it actually is to be put on the abandonment list. Like often you have some people who own large second homes that are trophy ranches essentially, and they have a water right. And all they have to do is once every 10 years is they irrigate once every 10 years. And that is enough to demonstrate beneficial use and maintain their water right. So if you're doing more than that, you're fine. You're not under threat. The only caveat to all of this is if you do not have a measuring device, because to prove that you are actually using water and putting it to use, and legally everybody is required to have a measuring device in the state of Colorado, that proves that you're actually doing what you say you're doing. And so likely, I mean, if you're on a large ditch company, you're covered. Often this is for very small individual ditches that serve one water user. Those are, if we don't find a measuring device, it tends to happen in those systems. So when it comes to losing your water right, it can actually be pretty difficult. All right. So should I divert my entire decreed amount in order to ensure I protect my water right? Maybe your water right says you get 10 CFS or you get 1 CFS. And does that mean, okay, I need to always be diverting 10 CFS or 5 CFS no matter what? Because if I don't divert all that, will that affect my water right in some way? So the short answer is no. If you should not, if you need your whole decreed amount, yes, but if you don't, no, because diversions in excess of the amount necessary to do beneficial use are considered waste, and waste is a legal term in water law here in Colorado. And so we call this the duty of water. How many acre feet does it take to grow an acre of a certain crop? Because some of that water isn't actually being consumed by the crop. It is just helping push the rest of the water there. It's push water, it's carriage water. And, but when you start going into some places where it's like, okay, the duty of water here, I look and it's like, wow, you're putting 6 acre feet of water on an acre. That noticeably looks, I mean, you've got, unless if you're growing rice in a lot of places, which we don't do here, it's noticeable, and that can be considered waste. It's also just over irrigating can damage your crop, and you tend to have less yields or other issues with disease. And despite how much you divert, a crop can only consume so much water. The more you put on to a certain point, if that crop is only going to consume in a given day, I don't know, maybe half an inch of water, no matter how much you put on there, it's still only going to consume that half inch. And that extra water that is just being thrown on top of there can be considered waste, and it is not beneficial use. So what is the value of your water right? And I get this a lot, where a lot of people will assume that the value of their water right, it's the CFS. That's what's in your decree often, or in the decree of the ditch that you're on. And that is not true. The value of your water right, it's the beneficial use. And in agriculture, that is the consumptive use. That is what the crop consumes. So it's not, when they calculate, let's say you sell your water right to a local city, and you look and it's like, okay, I put 2 acre feet of water on this acre. The city's not going to get 2 acre feet of water. What they're going to get a fraction of that, because and they'll go through and they'll decide, okay, this 2 acre feet, what is actually the crop consuming? What is being lost through evaporation? What is being lost through runoff? And what's going through the soil profile? What's being absorbed by weeds? And all of a sudden that 2 acre feet just starts shrinking and shrinking, and you might just get an acre foot. And that is the value of your water right. is just the consumptive use. And over time, usually when we calculate this, we do it over a period of like 20, 30 years, and you throw out the driest years and the wettest years, and that's your historical consumptive use. And that is what the value of your irrigation water right is in Colorado, not what you divert. And how do we determine this? And so we use big fancy computer models to do this. And there's a lot of factors that go into it. Everything and these are most of them, but there's still more of precipitation, your irrigation method, your crop type. And they have a crop coefficient that they use for every kind of crop, soil type, supply, which is your diversion records, satellite imagery, temperature, wind speed, solar radiation. Lots of climate data goes into this. So what you divert is part of this. And how it fits into this is, let's say you grow alfalfa. Alfalfa takes 30 inches of water throughout the season. And what they can look at in your diversion record is okay, every year, we want to make sure that this person is at least getting what the crop can consume. Because if I say, okay, yeah, alfalfa can consume 30 inches of water, but every year they're only getting 20. You're not going to get credit for that extra 10. That is not counted, and that is not considered. It's only what you actually have supplied. So that's where the diversion records come in. But let's say, okay, that same alfalfa field, it needs 30 inches of water. And I look at the supply and it's like, wow, great supply. And there's 40 inches of water. So what? I am only going to count up to 30, because anything beyond that is waste. It is not being consumed. It's not the beneficial use of the crop. And so that's a big part of it. Also, irrigation method. And I mean, in the model, they'll say, okay, is it wild flood? Is it flood and furrow irrigation? Is it sprinkler? Is it drip? Are they using subsurface drip, above ground drip? And based on that type, okay, the more efficient irrigation you have, the more your crop will consume. And so that also is a big part of this. So what can increase or decrease your consumptive use? How about any ideas on that? So we have this consumptive use of what your crop actually consumes. What can increase or decrease that? So we've got environmental factors, so temperature, absolutely. And that's something that we're seeing statewide. As it's getting warmer, all crops across the state are going to be, their consumptive use will be increasing, every kind of crop. And we're going to see that as our seasons get longer and it gets warmer during the summers. So yes, your environmental factors is one way that and that's going to happen. Your irrigation method. I mean, if you shift from flood to sprinkler and keep on going from sprinkler to drip, you will be increasing your consumptive use. Often, I mean, in what we see, and you generally, not all crops, but most, I mean, you see it in the yields, that if you're flood irrigating and, okay, if you're on a rotation and you can flood that crop, I mean, you're delivering it at a more irregular schedule. If you're doing drip irrigation, you're delivering less water, but you're delivering it over a longer period of time, and often sometimes continuously. Where back to that flood irrigation, yeah, you're giving it a whole lot of water, but there's other times where you're giving it nothing when you're in between rotations on your ditch, or it's just not available. And so what we see over time is you spread that water application out, you're often going to be consuming more. And so that is one way to increase your consumptive use. Decreasing it is taking out acreage on it. If you're watering less, that will decrease your consumptive use. Watering, if different varieties or different crops, that may decrease your consumptive use. It may also increase it. So there are a few methods to that work. So just get back to this idea of just how your consumptive use and your irrigation methods change. Here's a nice flood irrigated field of corn. And so if you look on the right side, flood irrigation, its efficiency is all over the place. I mean, there's some places in Colorado where flood irrigation is 10% efficient, where 10% of that water that gets thrown on there is actually being consumed by the crop. There are some people I know, their flood irrigation is around 90% efficient. There's a couple of farmers where they have got that system down and they have very few losses, and 80–90% of that water is consumed by the crop. In general, though, we go with 50%. 50% of the water is consumed by the crop, and then the rest of that water, it goes to all these other different places. Some of it goes down into the subsurface, and it'll eventually make it back to either an aquifer or the river. And then above that, we've also got evaporation, you've got runoff, phreatophytes, or that's the fancy word for weeds. And so all these other things use up those extra shares. And so back to your historical consumptive use, again, all you're getting credit for is that 50%. That is the value of your water right. That is the beneficial use. But now, okay, let's say for a lot of reasons you want to improve your irrigation infrastructure. And often the one we see most is just it's labor. It can save you a ton of time on labor. You can also be producing more. There's a lot of good reasons for that. And all right, here's a nice sprinkler irrigated field with drop nozzles. And in general, sprinklers, I mean, 75, but often 85, 75 or 70 to 85% is where we see a lot of this efficiency. And so now you're applying less water at a given moment, but more often the crop is consuming more of it. And you can see here, wow, your beneficial use, your consumptive use just increased significantly. And so did the value of your water right, because that is what is actually being put to beneficial use. And you're going to see it in the yields in most crops. You do see that. But now what also we see is happening is, since the majority of what you're applying is being consumed, that means there's less evaporation. There's also less runoff. There's less subsurface drip. There's less water being absorbed by all those other plants. And so you are consuming more. But legally, this is something you are allowed to do throughout the state, is change your irrigation method. In southeastern Colorado and the Arkansas Basin, it is a bit more difficult because of our compact with Arkansas, with Kansas, my mistake. And you have to actually pay. You have to go and seek out an additional source of water to make up for the extra water you're consuming. So that's a bit difficult, but that's only in southeastern Colorado. Everywhere else, you are free to change your irrigation system any way you want. That is your legal right, as long as you're staying within the amount you divert. So if I increase my efficiency, often what we see is you're diverting less water, because now those open channels you had, and if you put it in pipes, you just need less push water. You need less carriage water, and you might be now diverting more often, but it's significant. You are going to be diverting less. What happens legally in your situation? So if you were diverting 10 CFS and now you're going to divert 5 CFS, that extra water that you're now not diverting, it's going to, that extra 5 CFS is going to go downstream and be picked up by your neighbor. And so then over time, and when I say over time, I mean really 10, 20, 30 years, your decreased diversion can be considered the character of the water right. So this is pretty vague. But what it means is that, okay, yeah, you have your decree that says 100 years ago, you can divert 10 CFS, but the past 20 years, you're only diverting 5. So it can, at times, it can come up now that it's like, well, that's what the water right is now. And it can actually change, and what you're decreed to divert can change. It doesn't happen that often. It's very rare, but it is something that now that is considered the character of the water right. And especially in terms of administration and how the river's administered by your local water commissioner, they'll, even though on paper it says you have 10 CFS, they will run operations like you only need 5. And that should work. I mean, in certain extreme circumstances, you might have to go back to that 10 CFS if for your irrigation system is having problems, or maybe you want to go back to flood irrigation. But in general, it's going to be treated, and this isn't a legal change. But your water commissioner will treat it as like, well, that's what the water right is now, even though legally it's not changed. But legally though, it can. And this is something that is another thing that is very uncommon, really did not come up until 2 years ago for the first time in the history of Colorado, and that's partial abandonment. And it only came up in northwestern Colorado in the Yampa, the White, and the Green Rivers. And it really just came up because the division engineer wanted to do it. No other division engineer has expressed any interest in doing this. No other state engineer has ever expressed interest in doing this. So it is, I'm mentioning it just because it does exist. I wouldn't worry about it where you all are at, but let's go back to that situation where you're now increasing efficiency and you're on the Yampa River, and now you're only diverting 5 CFS. Every 10 years, when they do that abandonment list, they'll say, okay, you're only doing 5. We're going to change the decree in your water right legally, and it will now go from 10 to 5. So I wanted to mention that because that is out there. It is, but like I said, unless if you're on the Yampa or the White, you don't need to worry about it. So we have these, there's a lot of opportunities here for improving your irrigation system in Colorado. And I'm curious, how has dealt with NRCS and gone to your local NRCS office? So I have the question, we have a local NRCS office. Yes, you do. You do have a local NRC office right there in Grand Junction. And that field office, it's where the Farm Service Agency is. And NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, they oversee quite a few funding programs for agriculture. And the biggest one that is most relevant to what we refer to as on-farm improvements is EQIP, EQIP, EQIP. And the EQIP program, it's been around for decades, and there's good and bad to the EQIP program, and they will do a lot of cost share on everything from irrigation systems, ditch systems, to reseeding. There is a lot of help that they can do, and whether it's sometimes they'll cost share 25%, anywhere to 75%. It all depends on the project. And so your local EQIP office, and so EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Programs, there's just a few restrictions. Your average adjusted gross income, and for an individual, and then taxable income for an entity, has to be less than $900,000. So there's that. You have to control through a lease or own the land that you want to do the project on. And then you just go to your local NRCS field office. You have one right there in Grand Junction, and and the first step to any of this is getting a conservation plan. And in some counties, this can take a while, like a year. This is the bad of NRCS, is they are understaffed nationwide, and they don't have the people. And so even if you're not sure about in going through one of these programs to get cost share to improve irrigation systems, if you have time in the next week, I'd go to your local NRCS office and talk about and just say, I want a conservation plan, and get that ball rolling, because your mind might change. I mean, because this is a long-term process. I mean, it can take it going through not just the conservation plan, but actually a project. We're talking years. And so I'd say now is the time, even if you're not sure, just start getting that ball rolling. And it starts with just first making that conservation plan. I mean, if you're on a small amount of acreage growing grapes, it's going to be a fairly easy conservation plan. It can get a lot more difficult on larger properties of 1,000, 2,000 acres and growing a variety of crops. Those are a nightmare to do. And they'll work with you on making that plan. And then after that, you will start an application for the EQIP program. They accept them on a continuous basis throughout the year. They make their determinations at a few key areas, usually twice, once in the spring, once in the fall. And they'll also like check your eligibility just to make sure that there's a lot of things that they have to make sure you're in compliance with. And then they rank your application. This can be a frustrating part of the process. And sometimes you rank out and it doesn't go well. That same application next year might get accepted. And it's really, with the amount of funding they have, that is their process for how determining what they can do, because often there's more requests for funds. But it's something that it's not like applying to Harvard. I mean, if you've gotten that far, it's going to eventually happen. And then implementing your project. They work on a reimbursement system. So when you make those expenses, they can reimburse you for them. They can't just pay you the cash out up front. And like I said, often it's a cost share. It could be 25, 50, 75%. It depends on quite a few different factors of how much they'll do just a project and you specifically. I mentioned a few things and I just want to so the EQIP, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly. EQIP in Colorado provides millions of dollars a year. I mean, it is all over the state it is used. It can be a huge boost to if you're just not quite there to help with a lot of these on-farm projects. It can take a while. I mean, and so that's why I said it, especially if you need to do that conservation plan, and it isn't doing the plan and doing the application, that's not what takes a while. Waiting to hear back from NRCS is what takes a while. And so that's where you really want to get that started now. And that's probably, yeah. And then the ugly is just there's issues with design and engineering and inflation. So if you have an EQIP project and you're going to get funding, often they want to do a design. This is where NRCS nationwide is short-staffed and they don't have enough people to do the design. And this sometimes can take on larger projects, especially projects that involve like a ditch system. We're talking years, 2-3 years. Their program is better equipped for handling smaller on-farm projects. And so that usually goes a lot faster. If it's still not fast enough for you, you can pay for an outside engineer to do the design. And if you have the money, you can save yourself some time. This engineer, you need to make sure that this is an engineer that's acceptable to your local NRCS office. And you just can't find an engineer and they say, yeah, I'm fine, I'm good. No, you need to make sure and check with your local office. I want to work with this engineer. And often that engineer will have something we call a TSP. They're a technical service provider. They need to be certified in that way. And in some places, and this is where it all depends on the office. They might not be a TSP, but either they have a good history and a good working relationship with that office. And they're like, sure, fine, you can use that engineer. But that's something that, yeah, you need to make sure. And if you don't have an idea of an engineer, you can always ask them. And it's like, well, do you know someone outside who I can pay to get this done? And yes, they can help you out with that. And takes more off their shoulders. So they'd be more than happy. And then it's just the inflation, that there are times that, especially on the larger projects with like a ditch, where they issue, okay, here's the amount of money we're going to pay, we're going to give you for this project. And by the time they get to the contracting, inflation is kicked in, and what was 50% of the project they were providing is now 25, and they don't adjust at all for inflation. But shorter projects, on-farm projects, sometimes that can be a problem. I know some people who've had that recently. Hopefully we're through, like, just because of how bad prices have skyrocketed the past few years, hopefully we're through the worst of that, but that is something to keep in mind with that. And so it's other programs in terms of trying to get funding for on-farm work. There aren't a lot of options because EQIP and NRCS is it's just such a huge organization that all these other state and federal programs that have come up throughout the years, they just figure that, well, that's EQIP, that's an EQIP project. And even now when EQIP is functioning below our needs, you're not going to have luck going to some of these other programs and asking for funding to put in micro irrigation or a center pivot. They'll just be like, oh, that's an EQIP project. You go there and you get in line. And so, like I said, it's a lengthy process. And if you have time next week, this week, go to your field office and start on a conservation plan and just get in line. And maybe you don't want to do it now. Maybe you're not sure. It's just worth putting that in there. But like the other, like whether it's at the Water Conservation Board, the Colorado River District, all of them will tend not to fund any kind of on-farm work like this. And so it's can be frustrating, but it can really pay off if you're willing to be patient and if you start early with that program. So I'm gonna, let me stop. That was quite a bit. And I'm going to stop right there and just see, do I have any questions?
Feel free to unmute yourself and just ask it if you have a question, or drop it in the chat.
Okay. Right. Well, and like I said, if that, let me pull up that. If you wanted it, a lot of what I talked about, you can look online, and this is with the Colorado Water Institute, this report. It's 12 pages. It's a piece of cake, and it sums up a lot of what I've talked about today. And just how, if you want to do certain things with your water right, how does that actually affect the water right, whether it comes to conservation or efficiency. So that's out there. It's a good report. It's a breeze to run through, so that can be really helpful. And I do a lot of work with just water all throughout the state. And so if there's any other questions that people have in the future, feel free to reach out.
How do we reach you?
So the best way let me put that in the information. coagwater@gmail.com. So that's my email, just coagwater@gmail.com. And yeah, I mean, and I know that I'll actually be in your area Tuesday. We're doing a meeting with Grand Valley water users about just water quality issues. So we'll be talking about that at their office next Tuesday. And I think that's at 2:00. And right now, just, yeah, lots of outreach, and just, I've never had a chance to really speak to the grape growers, but it's always exciting to just meet more people and new groups doing this work in Colorado. So thank you.
We were happy to have you here with us today, and this is one more option for you guys to give any questions. That'd be great. Or reach out to him after this. I'm sure he'd be happy to answer your questions or pass you off to a person who can when he can't. So one last call for questions, and if not, we're pretty much done. I am going to drop a link into the chat for upcoming events through Viticulture Extension. And I would love for any of you guys to contact me or him about water because I'm always ready to learn more. So thank you all for attending, and it was great to see you.